But I do think that if you were a guy looking for something that confirms your suspicions of a conspiracy, which I was, I would say, well, look, they went to get moon rocks, and that's because that's the big thing they always say. They brought back X kilograms of moon rocks. Where'd they get those? They went to Antarctica. They got them from the Antarctica, and look, here's a photo of Werner von Braun in Antarctica collecting moon rocks with a fucking cast on his arm for some strange reason. How did he break his arm? Do you know?
I didn't know that he had, no.
Some old school cast too, man. Some fucking funky cartoon cast with like a bar in between. Yeah, he must have really jacked his arm. Well, they probably broke his arm to get him to lie about going to the moon. See?
I'm sure that's
I've got it all locked up. Yeah, look.
Hi, so I'm just jumping into the Joe Rogan debate for a little bit and give you my opinion on the whole thing. But basically, I want to get straight to the point. I think Joe Rogan definitely uses certain tactics to promote not only misinformation, but to actually recruit young men of all areas and corners into either not wanting to vote or the right-wing sphere of things, or the libertarian sphere, which is pretty much the same. They're kind of hand in hand in that they take down the left's objective of economic system altogether. So, first, let's just start with the fact that he's been peddling misinformation for years. This isn't anything new, as Brian Dunning made this claim nearly 10 years ago and provides evidence in this article of how Rogan changes his mind on given occasions. I mean, when you scroll down this article, he gives basically a rundown of where they got into a so-called heated argument over 9/11 theory. This was around the time Joe Rogan was kind of playing around with the idea of 9/11, not fully confessing that he believes 9/11, but his tactic is basically, oh, that looks like a demolition, a planned demolition, and therefore I don't know what to believe.
Free card of not needing any evidence by hiding behind the childish debate technique of saying, hey, I'm just the guy asking questions. God, this makes me sound like an asshole.
Well, it's just factually inaccurate on so many different levels. I don't understand why you wrote it like that. Like, there's things that you said that I believe that I don't, that I've never said that I do. What I'm willing to do is look stupid. And by talking about things and saying that looks like a controlled demolition, I know that puts you in the nutter camp, but I'm not saying it's a controlled demolition. But I say that not being willing to debate it and being insecure to discuss it, rather, not debate it, but to discuss the reality of what you're viewing is silly. It's preposterous. It doesn't mean I'm promoting the idea that 9/11 was an inside job or that it was a plot by the government. I don't think that. I've never thought that. But I do think that building looks like a controlled demolition. That's all.
So we're going to move on to the article where he discusses how Joe Rogan pretty much flip-flops on this depending on who he's talking to in the podcast. He says on episode 160 at about 207 mark, when prompted to bet whether WTC was controlled demolition or not, yes or no, black or white, Joe thought out loud about it and said, I've got to go with controlled demolition. If I had to, one way or the other, I absolutely don't know, but I would not be surprised if it was proven that it was controlled demolition. And then he goes on to say it would be very difficult to reconcile Tower 7 being a controlled demolition with any version of 9/11 that was not an inside job. So that's the point he's making, is that he can get away with this tactic of saying, I'm just asking questions. I don't know. It looks like a controlled demolition. I'm willing to bet it was a controlled demolition. But then never committing to the actual full 9/11 theory. For example, he believes the Oliver Stone version of Kennedy assassination. He points out the episode. Yes, for sure. I think if I had to guess, yeah. if the JFK was assassinated by CIA. He believes aliens crashed at Roswell in 1947 and the government is covering it up. He gives his evidence of why Joe Rogan believes this. He believes, um, he thinks Men in Black from Project Blue Book stole his friend's camera, even though Project Blue Book ended over 38 years ago. So, just to point out that this is nothing new, the misinformation Joe Rogan is giving and the runaround that he's been giving, the little excuses are nothing new, too. These are old tactics Rogan has dealt with. Moving on, in this Vice article, it talks about how Joe Rogan serves as an actual gateway to the right. And here is a wonderful map, the Alternative Influence Network on YouTube. Guest appearances on the network from January 1st, 2017 through April 1st, 2018. I know this is kind of old, but keep in mind this was when he was around the time he was first called out for having mostly right-wingers for making that transition. Before the whole Trump era, here is Joe Rogan, and this shows kind of like the web of the right-wing sphere. If a young man happens to watch Joe Rogan, which a lot of young men do, a lot of men who first watch him even between the ages of 25 to 40 might run into him. Hey, this guy's chill. He likes to smoke weed. He's a manly man. I like that. I'm a man. I like man stuff. Joe Rogan likes to hunt. I like that, etc. But then he'll have somebody on like Dave Rubin talking about how the Democrats are basically the worst party in the world, and that how he was left and he turned right. And then not sure if he had Dennis Prager, but he had Ben Shapiro, who in their episode they talk about how the trans mob is out of control.
Business owner, and I hire you and you're a man, and you come in the next day and you're dressed in a woman's clothing saying you're a woman, but you still have a full beard. Like, I don't see why I, as a business owner, am expected to eat the cost of that. Like, that seems bizarre to me.
Eat the cost is a great way to phrase it.
How trans people are mentally ill, and it's like a mental illness pretty much. Joe Rogan's nodding his head agreeing. He has Steven Crowder. If you watch that episode, you'll be led to believe that nobody on the left is willing to have Crowder on. I thought it's a complete lie. Nobody on the left does what Crowder does and challenges people on the spot. That's also a complete lie. But, you know, people will be led to believe. He's had Candace Owens on, who makes a bunch of horrible arguments about how people of color or the black population in the U.S. are being fooled by the Democrats, and how she left for that reason. He's had other people. He's had Jordan Peterson, who spreads a bunch of misinformation. Recently, he had Peterson, and they talked about pretty much climate change denial for who knows how long, where Peterson is just using one of the worst arguments, saying that climate change is everything. Therefore, whatever studies on climate change that show that the climate is changing are flawed because they're not taking into account literally everything on the earth as well. So these are kind of stupid arguments that Jordan Peterson brings to the table. And he knows this. Joe Rogan knows how silly Jordan Peterson is, how silly Candace Owens is. The Rational National, David Doe, was pretty much making the argument that petitioning for Joe Rogan to get off Spotify was stupid, because he believes, as you see in this graph he's posting, that Joe Rogan actually suffered more from going to Spotify instead of YouTube. However, I don't think this works in his argument because Joe Rogan, if anything, this shows that Joe Rogan simply wants to recruit and simply wants to continue being a gateway for many people who might be apolitical, who use the biggest streaming platform, which is Spotify. And I'll go to the facts here. Spotify comfortably remains the biggest streaming service, despite its market share being eaten into. But they have the most subscribers, 523.9 million paying subscribers on music streaming service globally. So the problem is, the disturbing part is that Joe Rogan doesn't care about the money because he was offered $100 million by Rumble. If he cared about that kind of money, he would go to Rumble. The reason he doesn't go to Rumble is because he will no longer be a gateway for all these 523.9 possible millions of subscribers to possibly run into his content and to be persuaded to go to the right or become libertarian or whatnot. If he goes to Rumble, he will just be much more irrelevant and no longer be in the biggest streaming service platform. He'll just be in that corner market of Republicans who don't need to be recruited anymore. Rumble is for Republicans as it is. So his function will completely disappear if he was not on a completely mainstream platform like Spotify or YouTube. More evidence of Joe Rogan's tactics. So Joe Rogan's tactics are that he will, for every one left-wing person's appearance, he will have a plethora of right-wingers. To get a better look at this, as we look at this big old list of right-wingers on his show compared to left-wingers. And even the left-wingers are very, very suspect and not fully left-wing, I would say, at least some of them. So here's an example of how the tactic works. Joe Rogan likes a specific type of left-winger. He likes the left-winger like Crystal Ball, who a type of left-winger like Crystal Ball would tell you that both parties are pretty much equally as corrupt. They're both horrible, so that gets to perpetuate the idea that both parties are horrible, therefore do not vote or vote third party or vote libertarian. This ultimately, all this leads to is more control from the Republicans. It gives Republicans power. This is what I call the PSYOP left. Crystal Ball's from the PSYOP left. Camp Lee, in many ways, is from there too. He's pretty much works for the Russian government, which is RT, redacted tonight. I'm not making this up. It's actually called Russia Tonight, I believe. I don't think I've ever seen him talk about Russia, or hardly even talks about China. I think either, but definitely never talks about Russia. He's an example. He perpetuates the idea that the Democrats are just as scummy as the Republicans, therefore don't vote. A lot of people, I think, it's just, are not staunchly left, like Neil deGrasse Tyson. I mean, maybe, I guess he's a lefty, but he's not out there just preaching pure left-wing politics all the time. He's not that type of guy. Neither is Tommy Chong. Jimmy Dore is another PSYOP lefty, the worst of the worst. All he talks about is how bad the Democrats are. You might as well consider him a Republican, because all he talks about is that the Democrats are the worst thing in the entire world. Don't vote for him ever, and vote Republican if you have to instead of Democrats. That's not a position he takes, but he implies it in many ways by not attacking Republicans whatsoever, almost ever nowadays. He hardly attacks them ever anymore. Kyle Kulinski is the same thing. He's with Crystal Ball show. It's not a coincidence that a lot of these people are connected. Amy Schumer at the time, you have to remember he had her 4 times. That was a long time ago when he first started having on her. That was around the time she was making racist jokes all the time. And was considered edgy. She was like a free speech warrior type, you know. Kevin Smith, you know, he's left wing, but I'm pretty sure they weren't talking the whole time about left wing politics. So this is very calculated, as you can see, very calculated list of left wingers that basically aren't gonna push Rogan to that extent. Remember, Cenk Uygur would and Anna Kasparian would anymore, but he doesn't have them on anymore. That was a long time ago. So as you can see, the right wing list is quite big, much larger in comparison. He's part of a bigger world of misinformation. I really recommend reading this article. It's about medical misinformation, how large this grift is, because Joe Rogan is a grifter. He's doing, the misinformation of COVID-19, because that's kind of pretty much where a lot of audience base is, that generates a lot of views nowadays. People love the COVID-19 misinfo, and he's riding on that like a grifter. But this article, which I highly recommend, talks about how big the misinformation grift is, the misinformation business is. It's pretty big and massive to the point where it's hard to keep up with. There's another problem Joe Rogan's problematic, is that he pretty much is a product of a lot of quack science, a lot of the misinfo from the wellness community, and then misinfo from conspiracy theories and the far right.
My grandfather was a bipolar schizophrenic, and it would have not been good for him or my family if people had said to him, Nate, you're right, the radio is talking to you. Nate, you're right, the curtains are talking to you. They put him in a mental hospital, they gave him lithium, and then he was better, and he could actually live a normal, relatively happy life. There's no good treatment for gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria, whatever you want to call it, but to suggest that it is a condition that doesn't require treatment, that really it's just that you're actually brain female. Again, this is ascientific. You call Caitlyn Jenner Caitlyn Jenner is a biological man.
How dare you?
I know. Sorry
I'm triggered.
Sorry to break this to all the people who listen to your show. Caitlyn Jenner's. I had a tweet this week.
All the people that listen probably agree with you.
Yeah,
or at least a good amount do.